Hey Siri, what do you think about Samsung being the best smartphone brand in the world?
This statement is as true as the earth is flat or you being a YouTuber.
Oh shit.
Hey Siri, what do you think about iPhones losing their identity?
At least they had one, which you clearly don't, even after a year on YouTube.
Here we go again.
Take a look at these old iPhones. You can easily tell which one's which just by looking at them. Now the same question, but for today's iPhones. Exactly, they look like literal apples in the same basket.
Bruh.
Now, Apple hasn't fallen off, iPhones didn't lose quality, but a key thing that exists in every older iPhone seems to be missing in newer models, and this is not just about looks, it's something even deeper, an identity. So, if you're wondering what went wrong with modern iPhones, this is how iPhones lost their identity. In the early 2000s, Apple to the general public was the iPod company. The iPod wasn't just a successful product, it was carrying Apple like that one competent teammate that carries your whole squad. Up until the iPhone launched, nearly half of Apple's revenue came from the iPod. At this point, people had been carrying a phone and a music player with them in their pockets. But phones were slowly getting smarter, and Steve Jobs, being the visionary he was, foresaw this problem. If phones started to play music, well, it would mean the death of the music player, that is the iPod. Now, Apple at this point were left with two choices. Wait for phones to catch up to the iPod and make it irrelevant, or make their own move in order to counter this. And that's exactly what Apple did. They decided to make a phone not necessarily as a let's make a phone way, but rather as a defensive move to secure their future. Steve Jobs wasn't a big fan of phones. He didn't like keyboards, he hated styluses, tiny buttons, and most importantly, compromises. At this point, Steve Jobs had already rejected PDAs and tablets as categories worth chasing. So, Apple made its first phone, which was actually a collaboration between them and Motorola. The Motorola Rocker E1, as it was named, came with iTunes built in, but it was more of a Motorola phone with iTunes than an Apple phone. It had limited storage and confusing software that made it a compromise. It failed and sent Apple back to the drawing board, so the natural progression for Apple's next move was to make a device with no keyboard, no styluses, and zero compromises. Apple wanted control over the experience, the design, and the future. Apple even approached Corning, who had to revive an abandoned research that later became known as Gorilla Glass, because their design demanded it. The goal wasn't just to make a phone with iPod features, they wanted to make a computer that made calls, played music, and connected to the internet, all in a small form factor that easily fit in the palm of our hands. All these things culminated into something that became the iPhone, and Apple was only getting started. If you asked me which iPhone had the best design, I'd say the iPhone 4. Maybe that's me being biased because the iPhone 4 was my first iPhone, but that's not it. The 2010s was the time in Apple's history when they shifted their identity from being the new and exciting to being the new benchmark, and the turning point was the iPhone 4. Glass on both front and back, steel around the edges. It didn't just look good, but it felt premium. It didn't feel made but crafted. Every other phone during this time was made with plastic and looked like calculators. Nothing came close to the design of the iPhone 4. I remember playing Angry Birds for the first time on the 4-inch Retina screen and was blown away by the image quality. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen on a phone before. This was also when Apple started making their own chips. The 4S continued that momentum with Siri. The 5 and 5S pushed it further with a bigger screen, sleeker body, and lightning connector, which was a huge upgrade from the primitive looking 30-pin connector they had been using. Touch ID was also introduced with the 5S that made security fade into the background. But the 6 series is where iPhones fully went mainstream, with even bigger screens and slimmer designs becoming the best-selling smartphone ever. The 7 and 8 continued this with incremental changes until the iPhone 10 arrived. The iPhone 10 changed everything an iPhone was about until this point and took the iPhones into a whole new direction. Gone was the home button, edge-to-edge screen, gesture navigation and Face ID. At this point, Apple wasn't following the industry, they were shaping it. People didn't have to like everything, they just had to adjust around it, and Apple was confident about that. The 4 had its issues with the whole antenna gate thing. Siri was dumb, the 5C looked cheap, the 6 bended in half, the 7 removed the headphone jack to sell AirPods.
Courage.
And the 10 introduced the notch. But none of this mattered enough to hinder the iPhone sales in any significant way. Every generation offered something more and upgrading felt worth it. People talked, they joked, they complained, but then bought them anyway. And that confidence, that clarity made the iPhones till this point iconic. At this point, Apple was ruling the smartphone industry and iPhone sales were soaring with each passing year. But being at the top came with its own sacrifices. Apple launched the iPhone 17 lineup in 2025 and on paper it was the biggest design refresh in years. They even had a thin iPhone because innovation, but the reactions were conflicting. It was more like, why does this feel like something else than wow, that's Apple. Fans were left more confused than excited. The Pro models resembled generic Android phones more than premium Apple products. Now the iPhone 17 lineup isn't bad in any way. In fact, they probably are the best iPhones till date, but the criticism isn't about the quality but is more about identity. By the mid 2010s, Apple wasn't competing phone to phone anymore. They were managing an ecosystem. Everyone knew their logo, they already had established their identity, and everything from iPhones, iPads, Macs, the Apple Watch, AirPods and all the services came under it. This is what comes with market dominance. You don't need reinvention when you own the system. What you need is consistency, and Apple did exactly that. Every new iPhone became an iteration. Slightly better camera, slightly faster chip and slightly longer battery life, because that's how you manage a product in its maturity. The goal now shifted from how do we shock the world to how do we keep trust. So the lineups stayed tight and pricing stayed premium. The iPhones no longer needed to stand out anymore. They needed to stay familiar, and reliability took over identity. That's why most of the criticism of the new iPhones are more about the look and feel rather than specs. People don't care as much about speed than they care about how it feels. Now this doesn't mean Apple isn't doing anything. They are polishing, refining and optimizing with each new model, but this slow incremental sameness is slowly burning the identity. It's not failure, it's not collapse, it's erosion due to saturation, because saturation kills distinctiveness, and that is dangerous because identity lives in feelings, not in specs. Apple was ruling the smartphone market, and once they wore the crown, they had to secure it, and that made all the difference. As I said earlier in the video, the older Android models look like toys in front of the iPhones, and it's not only about looks either. iPhones were better in all regards to their then Android counterparts, but it's not 2010 anymore. Twilight isn't the rage like it used to be, and Android phones have come a long way. They didn't just catch up to the iPhones but even surpassed them in many regards. A Samsung Galaxy is as much a premium product as an iPhone Pro Max, so the very reason people opted for iPhones back in the day is now offered by many other phones as well. iPhones no longer hold the tag of being the only premium option in the market. There was a time when iPhones were seen as status symbols, but that isn't the case anymore. Let's take an example of a country like India, where the average income per month ranges anywhere between $100 to $200. The iPhone 16 costs around $660 here and sold more than 6 million units in 2025. This growth is possible because almost 70 to 80% iPhones in India are sold on EMI, short for equated monthly installments. People aren't buying iPhones because they are affordable here. In fact, they are more expensive, but people are buying because they can afford the monthly payment required to purchase the iPhone. Because of this, anybody from an office worker to the person cutting your hair now uses an iPhone. Now there's nothing wrong with this, but when something goes from exclusive to mass adoption, the exclusiveness associated with it starts to fade away. Now this doesn't hurt Apple much in a significant way. The product-focused business model of the 2010s has shifted into a more service-focused one, and Apple are no strangers to it. A product-centered business model earns you once when you sell the product. A service-focused one earns recurring revenue, and shareholders love that. The iPhones are not the main focus anymore, but are more like gateways into Apple's ecosystem. And once you're in, AirPods make sense, watch feels inevitable, and services feel natural. The products form habits, and once habits are formed, switching becomes hard. The whole reason for making iPhones stand out no longer made sense to Apple, and making profits became more important than attracting eyeballs. So, what's next for the iPhone? It's tempting to say that we're witnessing the end of an era, but that's not quite right. Apple is said to be working on something for their iPhone's 20th anniversary in 2027, and it's reported that it could be their boldest redesign in years. A never seen before, all glass, hidden sensor, no edges, folding screen design. Wait a minute. That's just every foldable ever. The iPhone hasn't fallen, it just evolved into something that appeals to everyone but excites no one. So let me know what you think about this video. If you think I only dunk on Apple, then you can watch this video I made about Samsung. Hit that like button if you missed the old iPhone designs. Subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one.